Bonjour, bienvenue à cette conférence de presse sur sur une annonce concernant la saison des feux de forêt de 2023, bien évidemment. Welcome to this press conference. I am Boris Prou, reporter for Le Devoir, and I'll be moderating this press conferences. We have speakers here, online also. So after a few brief remarks, we'll go to questions, first on the floor and then online. Nous prendrons les questions dans les deux langues officielles, d'abord dans la salle et ensuite sur Zoom. N'hésitez pas à poser votre question dans la langue officielle de votre choix. So we have, not in order, Jonathan Wilkinson, Minister of Natural Resources, Bill Blair, Minister of Emergency Preparedness, Patty Aidoo, Minister of Indigenous Services, Randy Boissonneau, Ministre du Tourisme, Stéphane Lauzon, secrétaire parlementaire de la ministre du Développement économique rural, et Chéri Romanado, député de Longueuil, Charles Lemoine. Apologies if I forgot someone. Ministers, you have the floor.
Thank you. Good morning. I want to thank certainly everyone for being here with us this morning. I would like to begin by acknowledging that I am joining you virtually from St. John's, Newfoundland, the traditional territories of diverse Indigenous groups. I certainly recognize with respect the diverse histories and cultures of the Beothuk, of the Mi'kmaq, the Innu, and the Inuit of this province. I also want to begin by noting that, and I think I speak for all of my colleagues here today and for Canadians across the country, the incredibly challenging circumstances that folks in Nova Scotia and in Alberta are facing. I know that we have Minister Boissonneau here today to speak to the situation in Alberta, and Minister Fraser certainly wanted to be with us today, but he's in fact on a plane on his way back to Nova Scotia to be on the ground as we speak. It is a simple fact that Canada is experiencing the impacts of climate change, including more frequent and more extreme wildfires. Canadians are seeing and feeling firsthand the effects of these fires. Wildfires disrupt transportation, communications, power, gas services, and water supplies. They also lead to a deterioration in the air quality, biodiversity, the loss of property, crops, and animals. They pose a threat to Canadians' livelihoods and Canadians' lives. Chaque année, environ 7500 incendies de forêt brûlent plus de 2,5 millions d'hectares de forêt. Il s'agit d'arbres qui ne peuvent plus être utilisés et qui n'absorbent plus de carbone. And the amount of forest burned by wildfire is projected to double by 2050 due to our changing climate, causing longer and more intense wildfire seasons, more extreme weather conditions, and increased drought. The risk is especially serious for remote and Indigenous communities across Canada, which often face the brunt of the impact. Let me be very clear. The federal government is here to support Canadians and at-risk communities throughout this year's fire season. The key to responding to wildfires is better prevention, better preparation, and better adaptation, all of which require accurate and timely information. The Canadian Forest Service has been involved in fire research for decades, working with partners across the country to increase our knowledge about wildland fires and improve the ability of authorities to predict and manage the risks. And through our Canadian Wildland Fire Information System, we create daily fire weather and fire behavior maps year-round, and hotspot maps throughout the forest fire season, as well as regional forecasts about current conditions and fire danger, so communities throughout the country can plan and respond accordingly. For this fire season and seasons to come, we're taking steps to do even more. Pour contrer la menace croissante et soutenir les communautés à travers le pays, le budget 2022 a engagé 516 millions de dollars pour soutenir l'atténuation, la réponse et la surveillance des incendies de forêt et pour améliorer la coordination fédérale des réponses d'urgence. This included close to $350 million to buy specialized firefighting equipment, train new firefighters, and incorporate Indigenous traditional knowledge in our fire management systems. Of this, so far, we have contributed to 6 provinces and territories to acquire firefighting equipment. This has been critical for our counterparts in the procurement of vital resources such as vehicles, mobile units, avionics upgrades, hoses, pumps, and enhanced communications equipment. It is expected all provinces and territories will participate in this funding this year. And I am pleased to announce today that under the first phase of our wildfire training program, we have signed agreements with 9 Indigenous communities and organizations to help train more than 300 Indigenous firefighters and 125 Indigenous fire guardians across this country. Respecting and incorporating Indigenous knowledge and expertise will improve collective understanding, make fire management policies more effective, and contribute to community resilience. In addition to investments outlined above, and in light of the urgent wildfire conditions in Western Canada, Natural Resources Canada is pleased to be working with the International Association of Firefighters to advance a pilot project that would increase Canada's wildfire firefighting capacity. This project would be focused on training structural firefighters to respond to fires in the wildland-urban interface due to the particular risks those fires pose to homes, communities, and infrastructure. It is our intent to get as many firefighters into the field as we can. This means more people with the skills, knowledge, and expertise in the communities that need them most. And as important as boots on the ground are, we also need eyes in the sky. And that is why we allocated about $170 million to develop the Wildfire satellite mission, the world's first purpose-built public satellite system for monitoring fires, which is targeted to launch in 2029. In fact, putting eyes on a fire is among the most valuable intelligence we can get, and the Wildfire Sat will give wildfire managers and scientists an unprecedented ability to get the big picture and help manage fires before they get out of control. Once operational, Wildfire Sat will help reduce wildfire losses, help us defend communities and avoid unnecessary evacuations, allow us to better protect our resources, infrastructure, and environment, inform emergency decisions, reduce health problems associated with smoke and air pollution, and help prevent more disastrous wildfires. And of course, we also need to and are taking steps to ensure we're better equipped to adapt. That is why, as part of the National Adaptation Strategy, the government is also launching a Wildfire Resilient Futures initiative to enhance Fire Smart Canada programming, a national program aimed at increasing neighborhood resilience to wildfires, conducting research and pilot projects on fire risk reduction measures, and creating a center of excellence for wildfire innovation and resilience. Moving forward, we all need to enhance and focus our efforts on fire prevention and firefighting. Les incendies de forêt ont certainement eu lieu avant que nous ne commencions à voir clairement l'accélération des effets du changement climatique. Cependant, nous vivons dans une nouvelle réalité, réalité dans laquelle nous devons écouter attentivement ce que la science nous dit. Responsible governments must have a thoughtful and aggressive plan for reducing carbon emissions on a pathway to net zero. However, responsible governments must also have thoughtful plans and take concrete actions for adapting the impacts of climate change that are already baked into our future. The federal government is here and available to provide assistance to provinces and territories that require near-term support. We are also making investments in building the capabilities that Canadians will need moving forward. The Government of Canada is committed to this through ongoing forecasting, training more firefighters, working with Indigenous communities, provinces, territories, and local communities by providing the equipment and the support that is needed to protect lives, neighborhoods, and our ecosystems. So once again, thank you for joining us today, and I would like to now hand the microphone over to my colleague, Minister Blair.
Well, thank you very much, Jonathan, and very much appreciative of the important announcement that you've made. Good morning, everyone. Bon matin tout le monde. Let me begin by acknowledging that we are gathered here on the traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. I'd also like to take the opportunity to begin by recognizing the firefighters, the first responders, the emergency management and search and rescue personnel, and in particular the community volunteers for their tireless work in keeping people safe and in helping those who have been displaced during this incredibly difficult and dangerous start to the wildfire season. British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, the Northwest Territories, Manitoba, Ontario, and most recently Nova Scotia and New Brunswick have all experienced serious wildfires that have prompted the evacuation of tens of thousands of Canadians, including from many Indigenous communities. To date, there have already been 1,826 fires nationally so far this year, and approximately 2.7 million hectares have burned. To put that in some context, that's over 5 million football fields. And the national average for hectares burned in the month of May over the last 10 years has averaged approximately 150,000 hectares. And so $2.7 million, I think, reflects how incredibly challenging this season has been. Across the country, there are currently 211 wildfires burning, and 82 of those fires are burning out of control. These conditions, this early in the season, are unprecedented, and of course, they are deeply concerning to all Canadians. And due to climate change, similar extreme weather events may continue to increase in both frequency and severity across our country. Every year, Public Safety Canada, in collaboration with federal, provincial, territorial, and non-government partners, plans carefully for the wildfire season. The Government Operations Centre, which is embedded within Public Safety Canada, coordinates the federal response to emergencies to ensure that we are ready to help should any province or territory require federal assistance. I have already been speaking to my counterparts and municipal leaders in some of the more heavily affected regions to ensure that they have the support that they need, and there is close collaboration between the Federal Government Operations Centre and emergency operations centres in each of the provinces impacted. Following the Prime Minister's offer yesterday, the leaders of all opposition parties accepted a briefing on the wildfire situation. I've also taken the opportunity to brief my critics from the Conservative Party, the Bloc, and the NDP. In response to such a situation, it's all hands on deck. Federal support being provided to date includes, on May 10th, we approved a request for federal assistance from the province of Alberta, which included on-the-ground support from the Canadian Armed Forces personnel and resources to assist with firefighting and the cleanup. And last Saturday, we announced that it was necessary to extend that support, and it's been extended. With federal and provincial contributions of our matching program with the Government of Alberta and the Canadian Red Cross has now raised over $20 million. And because this is such an effective way to help Canadians respond to these emergencies, we are also establishing similar matching programs with Nova Scotia and the Northwest Territories. As of this morning, I can confirm that we have approved the request for assistance from the province of Nova Scotia that we received yesterday. Working in close partnership with provincial emergency management officials, the Canadian Armed Forces are prepared to provide planning and coordination support, ignition specialist personnel and ignition equipment, and firefighting resources to assist with fire turnover, mop-up, and hotspot dousing. These additional firefighting resources will be used to relieve firefighters who've been working tirelessly around the clock to protect communities right across Nova Scotia. We are also assessing what additional resources can be made available through other federal departments and agencies. And outside of the request for assistance process, federal resources have already been provided to Nova Scotia, and they include the Canadian Coast Guard has provided support with airlifts, helicopters, surveillance and crew comfort trailers, and an incident command post. The Canadian Armed Forces has provided specialized fighting trucks and support equipment to Halifax through a military base memorandum of understanding. Transport Canada's National Aerial Surveillance Program has been supporting with aerial surveillance of wildfires, and the Public Health Agency of Canada has been providing beds, blankets, and cots from the National Emergency Strategic Stockpile. And through the Canadian Interagency Forest Fire Centre, or CIFC as it's often referred to, we have been able to mobilize additional firefighting resources and personnel from across Canada and around the world to assist with the response in Alberta, the Northwest Territories, and in Nova Scotia. Following these major events, rebuilding, repair, and reconstruction can take a significant amount of time, and we know how important that is to the communities impacted. And that's why the Government of Canada provides financial assistance directly to provincial and territorial governments through the Disaster Financial Assistance Arrangement Program. The provinces and territories design, develop, and deliver this assistance, and municipalities can make application to them directly for support in their rebuilding efforts. And the federal government will reimburse up to 90% of eligible costs that a jurisdiction incurs, including providing interim advance payments to address the early costs associated with recovery. Before I conclude, I'd like to acknowledge the incredible human impact that these disasters have on Canadians. Many have lost their homes, their livelihoods, and in some cases, their entire communities. We can also see and have witnessed remarkable acts of compassion, courage, and resilience in the face of great adversity. Neighbors have been stepping up to looking after one another, and leaders throughout our communities at the municipal, provincial, and at all levels have been there for each other. And as we witness the bravery of our first responders and Canadian Armed Forces members, who together with other partners and serve our communities, we can only say thanks. Our government will continue to be there for Canadians, and we will work together to prepare for, to respond to and to recover from this wildfire season. Thank you very much, and I'd now turn the mic over to my colleague, Minister Hajdu.
Well, thanks very much, Bill and Jonathan, for your comments. And indeed, the ongoing wildfires across the country have been incredibly challenging and heartbreaking. I've had calls from First Nations leaders, Indigenous leaders, at all times of the day and night who are going through truly harrowing circumstances, working to protect lives, support their members in temporary and fragile evacuee situations, and of course working to save and preserve what infrastructure that they can. Last week I received a photo from Chief Conroy Sepogum of Fox Lake in Alberta. It was really heartwarming, but you could see the exhaustion on the faces of the firefighters and first responders in that photo. Crews had been working around the clock in every location, coordinating evacuations, fighting fires, digging trenches, supporting members to keep people safe. And I reassured Chief Conroy and indeed all of the leaders that I've spoken with that Indigenous Services Canada will continue to support the evacuations and the people evacuated and to support communities in the critical work that they're doing to protect not just their members, but the community infrastructure that is so fragile to begin with. We also have reassured and continue to reassure all community leaders and members that we'll be there for the long term to help with the rebuild through the Emergency Management Assistance Program. I do want to point out that it's 51 First Nations so far since the beginning of 23 wildfire season that have reported impacts due to wildfires. And there's currently 18 First Nations communities impacted in BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Quebec, Nova Scotia, and Northwest Territories. Of these 18 currently being impacted, 15 First Nations have been fully or partially evacuated. It's displaced more than 5,700 people from their homes. And in Alberta, some First Nations have now begun to return home. The people and the families that are evacuated are facing a huge amount of emotional distress and day-to-day practical challenges. Of course, we're working with community leaders to make sure that people get their needs met, and they are diverse. People leave quickly, sometimes with very little notice. So things like clothing, food, baby formula, medications, medical equipment, all of these things can be missing, and the department works closely with First Nations leaders to make sure that when evacuees are often in difficult situations and crowded situations, that they can access the basic needs that sometimes have been left behind in emergency evacuations. Obviously, there's a huge demand for mental wellness and mental supports. This is a very sad and frightening time, so the department works closely with First Nations leaders to make sure that there are mental wellness supports for anyone who needs it, and I would say to individuals that are currently experiencing loss to reach out and to ask for support. It is a frightening and very sad time. When a First Nations community on reserve is evacuated, all the costs related to a wildfire response are covered through the department's Emergency Management Assistance Program. This program has evolved to be extremely flexible under our leadership, transformed to be proactive, so communities have the flexibility and the confidence that the resources they need will be there to cover things like accommodations, transportation, food, security, protection, mental health, and wellness supports. The department, as I mentioned, will also be there after the wildfires to help with the significant costs of recovery, including repairing or rebuilding of replacing of homes, roads, and many other infrastructure. I've spoken to a number of chiefs who have told me not only is the forest intricately connected to their way of life and their well-being, but it's also a form of employment for so many of their members who are heavily involved in the forest industry. So there's a huge amount of economic uncertainty in terms of what people are returning to and whether or not the jobs that they have relied on will still be there in the short term. The wildfires are devastating in their scale and scope, and the damage that they've caused to the communities will be enduring. It's a way of life for many people, including gathering traditional foods, the employment, as I mentioned. People are disrupted, and many people are grieving. So we'll continue to be there to support communities and provinces and territories, as well as community members during these difficult times and in the recovery. I do want to quickly acknowledge that while we're here today speaking of this unprecedented wildfire season, there is also ongoing flooding in several other regions. There are 8 First Nations right now currently impacted by flooding in Yukon, BC, and Ontario, with about 70 First Nations members evacuated due to the flood impacts. So these challenging situations illustrate the importance of the self-determination and the ongoing efforts to work with First Nations leaderships in provinces and territories to rapidly transform emergency management service agreements. And so my department is working with provincial and territorial partners as well as Indigenous partners as they face the ongoing threat of climate-related emergencies. And finally, I would echo my colleague, Minister Wilkinson's thoughts. We all have to continue to do what we can to address the climate change that is driving these unprecedented levels of crises. I now will turn over the mic to P.S. Lauzon.
Bonjour à tous. Tout d'abord, nos pensées accompagnent toutes les personnes touchées par les feux de forêt, confrontées à d'immenses difficultés et les communautés qui ont dû être évacuées. Je voudrais également souligner le travail inlassable des pompiers, des premiers répondants, du personnel de recherche, de sauvetage, ainsi que les bénévoles, les communautés, pour assurer la sécurité des gens au cours de ce qui a été le début d'une saison de feux de forêt incroyablement difficile et dangereux. Chaque année, la Sécurité publique Canada, en collaboration avec les partenaires fédéraux, provinciaux, territoriaux et non gouvernementaux, planifie soigneusement la saison des feux de forêt. La Colombie-Britannique, l'Alberta, la Saskatchewan, les territoires du Nord-Ouest, le Manitoba, l'Ontario et plus récemment la Nouvelle-Écosse et le Nouveau-Brunswick ont tous connu de graves incendies qui ont entraîné l'évacuation de dizaines de milliers de Canadiens. À ce jour, il y a eu 1826 incendies au niveau national cette année et environ 2,7 millions d'hectares ont brûlé. Cela représente près de 5 millions de terrains de football. À l'heure actuelle, 211 incendies de forêt brûlent et 82 sont hors de contrôle. Le Centre des opérations du gouvernement, qui fait partie de Sécurité publique Canada, coordonne la réponse fédérale aux situations d'urgence afin d'assurer que nous sommes prêts à intervenir si une province ou un territoire a besoin d'aide du gouvernement fédéral. Le 10 mai, nous avons approuvé une demande d'aide fédérale de la province de l'Alberta et samedi dernier, nous avons annoncé que nous prolongions cette aide. Grâce aux contributions fédérales et provinciales, notre programme de jumelage de dons avec le gouvernement de l'Alberta et la Croix-Rouge canadienne a permis de recueillir plus de 20 millions de dollars. Et nous sommes en train d'établir les programmes de jumelage similaires avec la Nouvelle-Écosse et le territoire du Nord-Ouest. Depuis ce matin, je peux confirmer que nous avons approuvé la demande d'aide fédérale venant de la Nouvelle-Écosse. Nous travaillons en étroite collaboration avec les responsables provinciaux de la gestion des urgences et des Forces armées canadiennes qui sont prêtes à fournir un soutien à la planification et la coordination, du personnel spécialisé dans le déclenchement des incendies et des équipements, et des ressources de lutte contre les incendies pour aider à la rotation des pompiers, au nettoyage et à la recherche des points chauds. Ces ressources supplémentaires seront utilisées pour permettre aux pompiers de se reposer après avoir travaillé 24 heures sur 24 pour protéger les communautés de la Nouvelle-Écosse. Nous évaluons également les ressources supplémentaires qui peuvent être mises à disposition par d'autres ministères et organismes fédéraux. En dehors de la demande d'aide fédérale, les ressources fédérales déjà mises en place disposent de la Nouvelle-Écosse sont les suivantes. Le soutien de la Garde côtière canadienne pour le transport aérien de soutien, la surveillance, les remorques de confort pour les équipages et un poste de commandement d'incidents. Les Forces armées canadiennes ont fourni 2 camions d'incendie spécialisés et un camion de soutien à Halifax dans le cadre d'un protocole d'entente avec la base militaire. Nous avons aussi le Programme national de surveillance aérienne de Transport Canada qui apporte également son soutien en assurant la surveillance aérienne des incendies de forêt. L'Agence de santé publique du Canada fournit des lits, des couvertures et des lits de camp provenant de la Réserve nationale stratégie d'urgence. Par l'intermédiaire du Centre interservices des feux de forêt du Canada, nous avons pu mobiliser des ressources et des équipes de lutte contre les incendies supplémentaires provenant de tout le Canada et d'à travers le monde pour contribuer à l'intervention en Alberta, les territoires du Nord-Ouest et à présent en Nouvelle-Écosse. Donc, à la suite des événements majeurs, La reconstruction et les réparations peuvent prendre beaucoup de temps. C'est pourquoi le gouvernement du Canada fournit une aide financière directement aux gouvernements provinciaux et territoriaux par l'entremise du programme aux accords d'aide financière en cas de catastrophe, remboursant jusqu'à 90 % des coûts admissibles engagés par une administration, y compris des paiements provisoires ou anticipés. Les Premières Nations de la Colombie-Britannique, de l'Alberta, Saskatchewan, du Manitoba, de l'Ontario, du Québec, des territoires du Nord-Ouest, du Nouveau-Brunswick et plus récemment de la Nouvelle-Écosse sont confrontés à des défis incroyables et déchirants en cette saison de feux de forêt. Nous reconnaissons que la situation évolue rapidement et nous gardons un œil attentif sur le Québec alors que les incendies commencent à toucher la province. Nous offrons tout le support disponible aux cris de la Première Nation de Wakasganish et à la bande des Inuits de Pessamit et continuerons à être en contact régulier avec ceux qui sont affectés sur le terrain et qui se battent pour garder leur communauté en sécurité. Nous reconnaissons que les changements climatiques augmentent la fréquence des incendies de feux de forêt et que la communauté des Premières Nations sont en première ligne, car elles sont souvent situées dans des endroits éloignés. Donc, les services aux Autochtones Canada continuera à soutenir les familles et les communautés au cours de cette situation d'urgence et sera également sur place après les incendies pour assumer les coûts de rétablissement, y compris la réparation, la reconstruction et le remplacement des logements et des routes et d'autres infrastructures. Avant de conclure, je tiens à souligner l'incroyable impact de ces catastrophes sur les Canadiens. Nombreux sont ceux qui ont perdu leur maison, leurs moyens de subsistance ou, dans certains cas, toute leur communauté. Donc, notre gouvernement sera là pour soutenir tous les Canadiens et les peuples autochtones touchés par ces catastrophes pendant la situation d'urgence actuelle et tout au long du chemin vers le rétablissement qui nous attend. Merci. Et j'aimerais maintenant passer la parole à ma collègue Sherry Romanado.
Bonjour à tous. Good morning, everyone. Je vous remercie de votre présence ici aujourd'hui. Comme mes collègues l'ont fait remarquer, les Canadiens ressentent les effets du changement climatique. Les incendies de forêt, en particulier les incendies intenses et extrêmes, sont devenus un phénomène annuel dans de nombreuses régions du pays. Ces incendies détruisent les écosystèmes, contribuent à la pollution de l'air, mettent en danger la faune et la flore, déplacent les communautés et, tragiquement, laissent des victimes. Et ce sont nos pompiers qui sont en première ligne dans notre lutte contre les incendies et le changement climatique. Nous sommes ici aujourd'hui pour envoyer un message clair. Le gouvernement du Canada est là pour soutenir les Canadiens et les communautés touchées par ces incendies. Et nous sommes là pour soutenir nos premiers intervenants. We can never emphasize enough just how important firefighters are to our communities and to our country. These brave women and men show unwavering commitment to their fellow Canadians as they put their lives on the line each and every day to keep the rest of us safe. They deserve our respect, they deserve our gratitude, and most importantly, they deserve our support. Je suis fière de défendre les causes des pompiers à Ottawa, entre autres par mon projet de loi visant à établir un cadre national pour la prévention et le traitement des cancers liés à la lutte contre les incendies. Parce que, nous le savons tous, les incendies de forêt ne mettent non seulement à risque nos communautés, ils menacent la santé, la sécurité et la vie de nos pompiers. During testimony before the Standing Committee on Health, we heard firsthand about the devastating and lasting effects the 2016 Fort McMurray wildfire has had on firefighters, who have suffered illness and trauma as a direct result of the massive acute exposure to the toxic carcinogens they faced during their heroic efforts. Wildfires don't just kill our communities, they kill our firefighters. La mise à jour d'aujourd'hui est donc très importante, alors que nous nous efforçons de prendre davantage soin de nos premiers intervenants. Nous veillons également à ce qu'ils disposent des ressources, de l'équipement et de la formation nécessaires pour s'acquitter de leurs tâches de manière sûre et efficace. Comme le ministre Wilkinson vient d'indiquer, il est essentiel d'investir dans des mesures de prévention des incendies, des systèmes de détection précoce et des technologies avancées de lutte contre les incendies, afin de soutenir leurs efforts et d'assurer leur sécurité, tout comme ils assurent la nôtre. That is why the partnerships that are currently ongoing through our dedicated federal fund that supports provinces and territories in procuring specialized firefighting equipment, such as vehicles, mobile units, avionics upgrades, hoses, pumps, and enhanced communications equipment, are so crucially important. Mais l'équipement n'est qu'une partie de l'équation. Un soutien sanitaire adéquat en est un autre. Le soutien aux pompiers signifie également l'embauche, la formation et le maintien en poste d'un plus grand nombre de premiers intervenants pour soutenir nos efforts de lutte contre les incendies. Dans le budget 2022, nous nous sommes engagés à former 1000 nouveaux pompiers sur 5 ans. Grâce à la première phase du Fonds de formation aux incendies de forêt de ressources naturelles Canada, nous avons pu signer des accords avec 9 organisations et communautés qui permettront d'embaucher 300 nouveaux pompiers autochtones et 125 gardiens de feu autochtones. Cela signifie qu'il y aura plus de personnel sur le terrain pour lutter contre ces incendies et protéger les Canadiens. Le gouvernement fédéral continuera d'investir en eux, dans leur équipement et dans leur santé. Today's announcement is yet another example of our government's commitment to protecting Canadians and to protecting those who bravely serve to keep us safe. Thank you. I now turn it over to my colleague, Minister Randy Boissonneau.
Merci beaucoup, Chérie. Merci pour tout votre travail acharné pour et avec les pompiers sur cette question très importante. J'aimerais aussi remercier le ministre Wilkinson pour l'invitation de participer aujourd'hui. Et moi aussi, je participe aujourd'hui des territoires non cédés des peuples algonquins et Anishinaabe. So, colleagues, I want to just say thank you for this opportunity to be with you today. And we can see from the participation of so many colleagues that our government takes a whole of government approach to emergency preparedness and disaster management. And from the Alberta context, I can say that Albertans, including many who live in Indigenous communities, have faced devastation and evacuation due to the ongoing forest fires devastating northern and central Alberta. And for an update, as of yesterday, or as of yesterday afternoon, 61 wildfires were burning in the province, 16 of them out of control, while 21 are being held and 24 are under control. And just earlier this week, Fort Chipewyan had to be evacuated, and my heart goes out to all of the residents of Fort Chip and everyone helping them to do that, including members of the Canadian Armed Forces. Pour un résumé de la situation en Alberta, ça c'est 61 incendies de forêt qui brûlent dans la province. 16 d'entre eux sont hors du contrôle, 21 sont maintenus et 24 sont sous contrôle. Et je pense que c'est important de noter que malgré les gains, la situation demeure dynamique et dramatique. Cette semaine, les gens de Fort Chipewyan ont été dû évacuer et je tiens à donner toutes mes sympathies à les gens qui ont dû quitter leur chez eux grâce au feu. And as colleagues have mentioned, unfortunately now we see fires in 7 provinces and 1 territory. Wildfires in Canada and around the world are getting worse, partly due to complicated influences of climate change and climate variability. And that's why it's very important, today's announcement, but also that our government continues to do everything we can to address climate change and to mitigate the impacts that we're going to be facing in the weeks, years, and months to come. I want to thank my colleagues present for their hard work at this challenging time and for all of the support that they have provided to you, Albertans and Canadians. Our government will continue to monitor the situation, and we are committed to helping Canadians in this time of need. And I want to thank, as has Mr. Blair and colleagues, the firefighters, the first responders across the country, and those from abroad who are helping to save lives in this difficult time. To all of you have my deepest thanks and gratitude. À tous les pompiers, les premiers répondants d'un océan à l'autre, et des gens qui sont d'outre-mer, merci beaucoup pour le travail que vous faites ici au Canada. Thank you very much, colleagues. And moderator, over to you.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much to all. On va prendre d'abord les questions dans la salle et ensuite sur Zoom. Vous pouvez utiliser la fonction lever la main et poser la question dans la langue officielle de votre choix. We'll now take questions first from the room and then on Zoom. Please use the raised hand function at this moment so I can hand you over the mic. So first, here in the room, David Turton, CBC News.
Hi, good morning, everyone. You've approved new military support for Alberta and Nova Scotia, Minister Blair. So can you tell us how many boots will be on the ground? When will they be there, the new support? And what parts of these provinces, Alberta and Nova Scotia, will they be going?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. First of all, the deployment of Canadian Armed Forces members in Alberta is well underway. There's approximately 450 boots on the ground. Actually, the Prime Minister and I visited the Armed Forces base in Edmonton, spoke to the commander on the ground and talked about the way in which they were deploying their personnel, and they have been fully engaged in the province of Alberta now since May the 10th. In addition, we've been working very closely with the province of Nova Scotia right from the outset of this event, and their Emergency Operations Centre very closely working with our Government Operations Centre here in Ottawa. There have already been Canadian Armed Forces personnel and equipment deployed in Nova Scotia as a result of existing memorandum of understanding between the naval base, for example, in Halifax and the city of Halifax. And so some of that work was well underway. We received a formal request for additional assistance, specifically asking for additional Canadian Armed Forces resources yesterday from the Premier of Nova Scotia. That was approved almost immediately by the Department of National Defence. There's been no delay, and in fact, we've been mobilizing those resources for a number of days in anticipation of them being required. So we have already been putting personnel into Nova Scotia. I don't have a precise number, but as that evolves over the next 24 hours, we will be able to provide greater particularity around the deployments and equipment and personnel that are being deployed. But in addition to the Canadian Armed Forces, there are a wide range of requests and services. One of the most important things, of course, is for firefighting personnel. And so through the Canadian Interagency Forest Fire Centre, which is an agency which is jointly run by Natural Resources Canada and the provinces and territories, and it's a collaboration that exists right across the country, first of all, to move firefighting personnel from different parts of the country, different provinces, and we've received excellent cooperation, first of all, in Alberta, then in the Northwest Territories, in Saskatchewan, and now into Eastern Canada, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia, where firefighting personnel have been coming from jurisdictions where their services aren't required to places where we need them. And we've been working on coordinating, bringing those forces to bear. And in addition, through that agency, CIFC, we also are able to reach out to some of our allies and international partners. And we're seeing firefighters also coming in from the United States, from Mexico, and from other countries that are part of a collaborative memorandum of understanding. And so we'll continue to do the work that is necessary to support the provinces and provide them with all of the resources that we were able to bring to bear. It is a very, very challenging, difficult situation. The responsibility for the initial response to these types of emergencies is always a local jurisdiction, either the regional fire department in Halifax, for example, and the provincial authorities. But we work very closely with all those municipalities and the provincial governments in order to bring the resources that we are able to provide and whatever assistance is necessary. And that's in the initial response. And then, of course, we also begin right at the outset the important work of preparing to help those communities respond from these events.
Okay. And just as a follow-up, and Minister Wilkinson, feel free to weigh in on this, or anyone else. We've seen bad forest fire seasons before. And some people might be sort of blasé about it. They just might become numb to all this news about forest fires. What do you want Canadians to know about how intense, how long this wildfire season will be, how bad it's going to get? What do you want to tell Canadians about that? So, Minister Haidu, Minister Blair, Minister Wilkinson, if you want to weigh in this, let us know.
I'll begin, but I think Mr. Wilkinson may have additional insights he wants to share. The situation that we're facing right now, we work with Environment Canada, with Natural Resources Canada, and my department in emergency preparedness in developing risk profiles for the coming year in forest fires. And we look at forest conditions, but we also look at projected weather-related events. The situation in Canada today is a very dangerous one. And what I've already outlined earlier is the average for the month of May is for the last 10 years average in Canada is about 150,000 hectares of forest normally burn on average each year. And so far this year, in the month of May, we're up to 2.7 million. So it's a significant increase in the amount of fires. And the situation that exists and has mapped out indicates a fairly either a high or an extreme level of ongoing risk in many, many parts of the country, including in Western Canada, British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, parts of Ontario and Quebec, and as we've seen most recently, even in Atlantic Canada and New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. And so we are, quite frankly, quite concerned with the early onset and frankly, almost without precedent, the extreme number of fires that we've already experienced so far this year, and we are very concerned about ongoing risk that the current conditions present. And that's why it's very important to bring awareness to Canadians, to make sure that they understand what risk, that people who live in areas that could potentially be affected by wildfire are prepared to first of all, move to safety and are prepared in order to keep themselves and their community safe. And as well, it's also very important that we all work very closely together and support each other through this very challenging series of events that has occurred and could occur in the future to make sure that we're ready. And that's why we're making significant investments in training additional personnel and moving equipment and building upon the important collaboration that exists between provinces, territories, municipalities, and the federal government.
I'll just add that, you know, it's May or June, I guess, early June. I live in a small municipality, and I received a notice from the municipality that there's currently a fire ban, and it's the beginning of June. And so I would also encourage Canadians to check with their local municipalities about what restrictions are in place for activities that many of us enjoy and don't take a second thought about, like having a campfire. There are many areas that are extremely fragile, and it's very early. You wouldn't necessarily anticipate there'd be a ban in May in a small community on the shore of Lake Superior, but there is. And so it's really important that Canadians keep an eye out in their own regions for what the restrictions are in terms of burning, so that we can all be part of preventing any further fires.
David, if
Maybe,
I may, go ahead,
sorry.
Jonathan. Go ahead, Jonathan.
Just a couple of things. I mean, certainly we are very concerned about the situation this year in many parts of the country, and obviously we're seeing very significant incidents already in a number of provinces that is, you know, burning significant quantities of the forest, and perhaps even more concerning, it is adjacent to many communities, which is requiring us to take all kinds of measures, including evacuation of many of these communities. It is not the case that we've never had forest fires before. We have had forest fires in the past, for sure. But what we are seeing is an increase in the intensity, in the number, and that simply is a function of a warming planet. And so I think it's very important that we actually think forward. We are almost certainly going to see, and science will tell us that we are going to see more and more of these kinds of things going forward. It means we need to be prepared. We need to be smarter about trying to ensure we're making investments to be able to actually prevent and to address. And that includes things like the Fire Smart program for communities to make them more resilient, to try to ensure that they are actually doing the things that can prevent impacts on communities. It means focusing on things like the pilot that we're doing with the International Association of Firefighters, which is about the interface between wildland and communities, trying to get to the point where we actually are really making progress in making these communities more resilient in the face of what we are going to be seeing on a go-forward basis. That's not a happy thing, for sure. Climate change is not a happy thing. But we are trying to get ahead as much as we possibly can of some of these things. And I think, we are seeing this year some very challenging circumstances. And unfortunately, we're probably going to see this recur over the coming number of years.
David, on this point, from the Alberta context alone, the amount of land in communities that have been burned just to this point in this fire season, if you compare that to the last 5 years of fires, what's happened already is 150 times more than the 5 years of loss preceding. So think about that. That's over 150 years of burning in this month that's already occurred. It is devastating. And from a personal effect, I talked to when the Prime Minister and Minister Blair and I were at Edmonton meeting with evacuees, we talked to a newcomer family from Mexico who now runs a dairy farm in Drayton Valley, and they spent all of their resources to buy this farm and run this farm, and the fire came through and took half of their land, half of their cattle, all gone in minutes. And that's the very real human cost. And as Bill has said, we've lost entire communities. People have lost their homes, and this is a devastating human cost. And for those people that know what it was like in Edmonton and Calgary during the May long weekend, ash in the backyards, ash all over the cars, and people not being able to go outside because it was 11 plus on the air quality index for 2, 3, 4 days. So this is a shared responsibility, a shared cost, and the cost of inaction on climate change is simply too high, and we're seeing it right now.
Judy Trin, CTV National News.
I'd like to know, in terms of the resources, right now we know that the greatest amount of fires are in Alberta. That is where the resources are concentrated internationally. We now see fires developing in the east. We understand from a technical briefing that the fire season has started in Ontario and Quebec, so those resources may be pulled out as well that are helping Alberta. Can you talk to me a little bit about how this is being managed and how fast can you react?
Yeah, thank you. It's an important question. There is, as I've said, we have CFC, which I think does an exceptional job in bringing coordination to those resources. But this is a particularly challenging time, and historically we've been able to deploy resources to a hotspot, and as we were already experiencing in Alberta. But clearly, when those fires they spread into Saskatchewan, Northwest Territories, and British Columbia, then across into Eastern Canada, there are a limited number of resources, and it's why Minister Wilkinson's announcement today is so important, because we recognize that we need investment, first of all, in training of additional firefighters, and that work is well underway, and it's really important that we get more people trained to do this work, because it has to be, that training is important, because it's a very difficult and dangerous job, and we want to make sure people can do it safely. And there are also equipment deficits across the country, and our ability to move people is actually fairly robust. Our ability to move equipment can be even more challenging. And so we're making sure that we have adequate and investing in adequate equipment in a number of places across the country. The situation does require a great deal of coordination. That coordination does take place between the provinces and territories. I meet very regularly with my provincial colleagues and territorial colleagues on bringing a greater level of collaboration. People work very closely together and support each other. But when every jurisdiction is facing challenges, and you're absolutely right, it's very difficult for them to move their resources from their area, knowing that they could need them at a moment's notice. And the challenge with wildfire is it can happen very quickly, and the impact of those wildfires can be very, very difficult if it's not contained in the earliest days. And so we are seeing the impact of that.
Talk to me a little bit about the firefighters themselves. Have you seen injuries? Have you seen, is there fatigue? What is it like for them?
Actually, I did have the opportunity last night. I connected and had a bit of a conversation online with a number of firefighters down in the southern part of Nova Scotia. An extraordinary bunch of people. And the vast majority of them, by the way, are volunteer firefighters. So they are community members that train and are prepared to respond, and they're doing an extraordinary job, but they're tired. They've been there a long time, and I worry, quite frankly, because when they become fatigued and when they've been on those fire lines for hours and hours and sometimes even days, that fatigue can result in greater risk for them. And so we want to make sure that there's additional help that goes there. But we also have the benefit of professional firefighter services, for example, in the Halifax region. But the training that, again, Minister Wilkinson referenced, that we're doing with the International Association of Firefighters, to train and provide additional equipment and training to professional firefighters in those municipalities, because one of the challenges we face, as Mr. Wilkinson indicated, wildfire is a natural phenomenon. It does take place each and every year. But where it becomes extremely challenging is when there's an urban wildfire interface, when the fire comes close to town. And as we're seeing in Halifax and in Shelburne and parts of Nova Scotia, as we saw in many parts of Alberta and Saskatchewan, and even in the Northwest Territories, that's when it becomes extremely difficult. And so making sure that those personnel have the training to do their job safely is very important as well. There's also, as Jonathan said, it's not just firefighters and firefighting equipment. There's a number of other really important supports that we're also ensuring are being provided, because people are being displaced, and even the ability to provide better intelligence, better information about where fires are burning, weather conditions is something Environment Canada provides, very regular updates, and there are a number of different important sources of information that everybody's feeding in to make sure that our response is appropriate and effective.
Mia Rabson.
Hi, yes. Good morning. I'm wondering, we know early on that there was a warning at the beginning of this season that this was going to be a bad season, or that the prediction was it was going to be bad. What did we do when we heard those warnings to immediately try and work on prevention? And what can we do now, knowing that we're at this situation and it's June 1st, to try and mitigate what could happen for the rest of this season?
Yeah, being better prepared for these things is something that we did recognize. And certainly, we talk about how challenging this season has been, but let's reflect over the past number of years. The Fort Mac fire in Alberta was extremely impactful, and there are lessons learned from that. We saw that the conditions this year were likely to result in a very challenging season, and that's one of the reasons we very early, we budgeted money, and we've been working with a number of different organizations across the country to improve training, to increase the number of firefighters. There's been very close work on emergency management and emergency preparedness, particularly with Indigenous communities, because I think they are most vulnerable to many of these types of natural weather-related events. And so that work has begun early in this season. And as I said, there's very close collaboration between ourselves and our provincial and territorial counterparts in the emergency world, in emergency management, and they work very closely together. But this has, as predicted, been a very challenging beginning to this season, and it reminds us that we've got a great deal more work to do. We also had in the first week in May, for example, Emergency Preparedness Week, and we tried very hard to communicate to people that we needed to be ready, that Canadians need to be ready. They need to have emergency kits. They have to know what their risks are in their communities, and they have to be prepared to act. And so public education is also very important. It's one of the reasons we're here today, is just to explain some of the challenges we face, the advice that Patty shared with respect to being fire smart and being prepared and taking the appropriate steps and listening to your local authorities. All of those things are really important. But we are reminded by these events and the increased severity and frequency of these events, both flood and fire, is that we need to do more work right across this country in building greater resilience and helping Canadians be better prepared and better protected from these types of events, because unfortunately we believe with climate change we're going to see a continued increase in the frequency and severity of these events.
And if I could just sorry, can I just add, Mia, that on our side at Indigenous Services Canada, I think the transformation of the emergency management program to be proactive and to be able to be flexible, provide the money and the supports up front without extensive requests for assistance that are, meticulous and detailed, and sort those details out afterwards, has really given the communities the flexibility to be able to themselves then plan to be more prepared for evacuation, have some self-determination about where they'll evacuate and how they'll support community members. Some communities are using innovative ways to shelter on the land, for example, in cases of flooding. And so that flexibility and trust in First Nations leadership is really allowing for much more rapid response. It's no less devastating, obviously, for communities, but it does give that assurance to First Nations leaders that as they're planning how to protect people and property, they have this financial resources and the support of a department to go ahead and make those arrangements quickly.
And maybe, Mia, I can just add a couple things. Certainly, we are very concerned to try to get some of these new investments stood up very quickly because we were looking forward to this year and coming years. And that's one of the reasons why we stood up the equipment fund midway through the year. It wasn't something we stood up at the beginning of the year. There are 6 provinces and territories that actually availed themselves of that money to be able to purchase equipment to be more ready for this season. We've also rolled out, as I said, 9 pilots for training of firefighters in Indigenous communities, which is something again that we work to accelerate. We made sure that Fire Smart Canada, which has been quite an important program, was actually enhanced and was a critical part of the National Adaptation Strategy because we recognize that this is something that we are going to need to double down on. And I would say that the initiative that we are about to embark on with the International Association of Firefighters was something, and I have to give credit where credit is due to the firefighters who came to us with this proposal, was something we had not baked into what we were going to do, but it was such a thoughtful proposal about something that is increasingly important in terms of that interface that we simply found the money to actually find a way to get going. So there are a number of things that we've been doing. It will help in some respects this year for sure, but it will certainly help for many, many, many years to come.
That sort of brings me right to my second question, Minister Wilkinson, which is why is it going to take 6 years to stand up the satellite wildfire program when we know the fire situation is as bad as it already is?
Well, look, I would love to have everything done tomorrow. I'd love to be able to get everything in place tomorrow. I think that the satellite system, this is a first of. It's really the only, it will be the only such system that exists anywhere on the planet. That means there are a bunch of things, including technology, that need to be further evolved as we actually move forward. We are moving as quickly as we can. If we can find ways to accelerate it, we absolutely will. But that's the realistic sort of timeline at this point in time.
Thank you very much. We'll now go on Zoom. Please use the raise hand function at this moment if you have a question for the ministers. We'll go first with Lindsay Jones from the Globe and Mail.
Hi there. This question is for Minister Blair. People in Nova Scotia are really stressed right now. We'd like to know a timeline around when the Canadian Armed Forces might be able to be here on the ground. Can you give us some information about when those additional resources will be here?
No, and listen, I very much understand and appreciate the anxiety, and we know the Canadian Armed Forces, I call on them frequently to help the people in emergencies, and they've always been incredibly responsive and effective when deployed. The Minister of National Defence approved this request the moment it was received. We're moving as quickly as possible. I anticipate we'll be able to provide an update later today as the Chief of Defence Staff mobilizes his people, but I can tell you we've anticipated this request. There's already been a mobilization of people. I'm hoping you'll be able to, people of Nova Scotia should see Canadian Armed Forces members on the ground providing assistance and support hopefully before the end of today. And we'll be able to provide you with more detailed numbers as the Chief of Defence Staff makes those available to us, but I can tell you that work is well underway, and we know it's important to the people of Nova Scotia. We'll move as fast as we possibly can.
And if I may just ask one follow-up, you mentioned that you're worried about the volunteer firefighters in southern Nova Scotia. Most of the firefighters on the ground down there are volunteer. What is the particular risk that you're concerned about?
Yeah, I've spoken to some of the people down there, and I was speaking to the mayor of Shelburne last night. They're doing an extraordinary job, but quite frankly, they need help. They need relief. And they need additional resources, and we'll work very closely with the province of Nova Scotia in response to their request for assistance to move additional resources down there. That is a particularly dangerous fire, and we're very concerned that it actually threatens a number of communities and other critical infrastructure in southern Nova Scotia, and so we'll move as quickly as possible to bring them that relief. We're very grateful and admiring of the work that they have done to date, and we recognize that they need additional assistance, and we'll make sure that we do everything possible to get it to them.
Thank you, Lindsay. That was the only question we had online. So unless one of you guys have another follow-up, je crois que cela conclut notre conférence de presse. Thank you very much to you all.